The head chef's face went white as marble when I responded to his Spanish insult in perfect Cuban dialect. The entire kitchen fell silent. 24 years old, standing there in my stained apron, I watched Marcus realize he'd just called the daughter of Roberto Rodriguez, Cuba's most celebrated chef, a worthless peasant in front of 3 Michelin critics. My name is Isabella Rodriguez, and at 24 years old, I was living a complete lie. Every morning for 3 months, I walked through the back door of Meridian, one of Miami's most expensive restaurants, pretending to be someone I wasn't. The other kitchen staff knew me as Izzy, the quiet prep cook who barely spoke English and kept her head down while chopping vegetables. What they didn't know was that I held 2 culinary degrees from Le Cordon Bleu. They had no idea that my father, Roberto Rodriguez, was Cuba's most celebrated chef, famous across Latin America for revolutionizing traditional Caribbean cuisine. And they certainly didn't suspect that I was documenting every single moment of workplace abuse for a book that would expose the restaurant industry's treatment of immigrant workers. I remember deliberately mispronouncing simple English words, stumbling over phrases I could recite perfectly. My knife skills, honed through years of training, had to be consciously slowed down to appear amateur. When Marcus, our head chef, watched me work, I made sure my cuts looked uneven, my technique sloppy. The performance was exhausting, but necessary. Marcus made his daily rounds like a predator circling prey. He was 38, tall and pale, with the kind of confidence that comes from never being challenged. His morning ritual always included stopping at my station, where he'd lean over my shoulder and critique everything from my posture to my breathing. The smell of his cologne mixed with kitchen grease made my stomach turn, but I kept my expression blank, nodding at his corrections like a grateful student. The tip incident happened during my 2nd month. We'd catered a private event for some tech executives, and the host had specifically praised the black bean and plantain appetizers I'd prepared. He handed me an envelope with $200, saying my food reminded him of his grandmother's cooking in Santiago. I felt proud for exactly 30 seconds before Marcus swooped in, plucking the envelope from my hands with a grin. "Thanks, sweetheart," he said, stuffing the money into his jacket pocket. "This'll help pay for your English classes, right? Gotta send less money back to Mexico this month." The fact that he couldn't even identify my nationality correctly added insult to injury, but I forced myself to smile and nod. Mexico, Cuba, Puerto Rico, to Marcus, we were all the same. The other kitchen staff pretended not to notice. Some genuinely didn't care, focused on their own survival in the high-pressure environment. Others, like Tommy the line cook, would actually laugh at Marcus's jokes, hoping to stay in his good graces. I cataloged each interaction in my mind, building a comprehensive picture of how abuse flows through restaurant hierarchies. My apartment in Coral Gables told a different story entirely. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Biscayne Bay, and my kitchen was equipped with professional-grade appliances that cost more than most people's cars. The contrast felt surreal, spending 8 hours being treated like dirt, then returning to luxury that my book advance and family connections had provided. During video calls with my father in Havana, I had to be careful. He knew about my research project, but not the specific conditions I was enduring. When he asked about work, I'd deflect with questions about his latest restaurant ventures or the cooking classes he taught at the Culinary Institute. His pride in my upcoming book deal with Chronicle Publishing made the daily humiliation feel more bearable, but some nights I questioned whether any story was worth this level of degradation. The breaking point came when Marcus announced that 3 prominent food critics would visit for a surprise review. He gathered the kitchen staff, his excitement palpable as he outlined his menu plans. What made my blood boil was hearing him describe his signature Latin fusion dishes. Recipes I recognized from my own prep work, techniques passed down through generations of my family, now branded as his innovative creations. That night, I stared at my reflection and wondered how much longer I could maintain this charade. The morning of the review, I arrived at Meridian 30 minutes early, just like always. But something felt different in the air. Marcus was already there, pacing around the kitchen like a caged animal, checking his phone every few seconds. His usually perfect hair looked disheveled, and sweat stains were already forming under his arms despite the industrial air conditioning. "They're coming today," he announced to the arriving staff, his voice cracking slightly. Food and Wine, Miami Herald, and James Calderon from Culinary Quarterly. My stomach dropped. Calderon had interviewed my father 5 years ago for a feature on Caribbean cuisine masters. If anyone would recognize advanced technique, it would be him. Marcus's panic transformed into rage within minutes. He screamed at Tommy for arriving 2 minutes late, threw a pan across the kitchen when someone forgot to restock the walk-in cooler, and made Maria from Prep cry by calling her absolutely useless for cutting onions slightly too large. But I knew the worst was coming my way. "Isabella," he barked, using my full name for once. "Get over here and start the sofrito base for my signature ropa vieja." My signature ropa vieja. The recipe my grandmother Esperanza had perfected during her 40 years cooking in Havana, passed down through handwritten notes that lived in my mother's kitchen drawer. I'd adapted it during my first week at Meridian, thinking I was just helping with prep work. Now Marcus was calling it his masterpiece. I moved to my station and began heating oil in a heavy pot, the familiar motions automatic despite my growing anger. The holy trinity of Cuban cooking, onions, bell peppers, and garlic, sizzled as I added them to the pan. Marcus appeared beside me immediately, breathing down my neck like a supervisor watching a criminal. "Slower with the cumin," he commanded, though I hadn't even reached for the spice yet. "You people always think more is better, but this requires European finesse." The casual racism in that phrase, "you people," made my jaw clench, but I nodded obediently. The critics arrived 2 hours earlier than expected, walking through the front door just as the lunch rush was beginning. I watched through the kitchen's pass window as Marcus rushed to greet them, his fake smile stretching across his face like plastic wrap. James Calderon looked exactly as I remembered from his author photo: silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from tasting exceptional food for 30 years. Marcus's panic reached new heights. He began shouting orders in 3 directions at once, contradicting himself every few minutes. When Tommy asked about the temperature for the duck breast, Marcus screamed, "Figure it out yourself." Then, 30 seconds later, he yelled at him for not asking enough questions. But his real fury focused on me. Every few minutes, he'd storm over to my station, critique something I was doing perfectly, then stomp away muttering in broken Spanish. His pronunciation was terrible. He said estupido, like estopido, instead of the correct estopitho. For someone claiming European finesse, his Spanish sounded like a tourist reading from a phrase book. The moment that changed everything happened when Marcus decided to show off. He approached the critics' table where they sat taking notes and observing the kitchen's controlled chaos. I could hear every word through the pass window. "Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Isabella," Marcus announced, gesturing for me to come over. My hands were covered in sofrito base, but he didn't care. "She's my little project. A simple immigrant girl I've been trying to educate about real cooking techniques." James Calderon raised an eyebrow, but Marcus was too excited to notice the uncomfortable silence. The other 2 critics shifted in their seats, clearly unsure about where this performance was heading. "Isabella, tell these gentlemen about your background," Marcus commanded, his tone dripping with false enthusiasm. "Where did you learn to cook before I started training you?" I opened my mouth to deliver my practice response about learning from my mother. But Marcus wasn't finished with his show. He wanted to demonstrate his worldliness, his connection to authentic Latin culture. That's when he made his fatal mistake. Switching to Spanish, confident I wouldn't understand his educated vocabulary, Marcus began his commentary. "Esta campesina no sabe nada," he said with a smug grin. "She's just a stupid peasant who thinks she knows about Cuban food." The Spanish poured out of him like poison. He told the critics that my family probably cooked scraps for tourists on the beach, and that real Cuban cuisine required European education and refinement, like his training provided. He described me as una inútil completa, completely worthless, and made crude jokes about my intelligence and legal status. "These people think throwing some cumin in a pot makes them chefs," he continued, his voice growing more animated. "But without proper technique, without understanding flavor profiles, they're just making peasant food." I felt my hands trembling, but not from fear. 3 months of swallowed pride, stolen tips, and daily humiliation crystallized into pure rage. Every morning, I'd forced myself to walk through that back door. Every afternoon, I'd smiled and nodded while he stole my family's recipes. Every evening, I'd driven home, questioning whether this research was worth my dignity. James Calderon was watching me carefully now, something shifting in his expression. He could see the change in my posture, the way my shoulders straightened despite Marcus's ongoing verbal assault. The other critics looked uncomfortable, but Marcus was too caught up in his performance to notice their expressions. "Mira," Marcus continued, pointing at me like I was an exhibit. "She probably doesn't even understand what I'm saying right now. These immigrants, they learn just enough English to take orders, but real education? Impossible." That word, impossible, broke something inside me. My father had built his reputation from nothing, creating dishes that food critics across Latin America called revolutionary. My grandmother had fed her family through revolution, embargo, and economic collapse, never once compromising on quality or tradition. My great-grandmother had preserved recipes through memory alone when she fled Spain during the Civil War. And this man, this mediocre chef, who couldn't even pronounce estúpido correctly, was calling my heritage impossible. The kitchen had gone quiet. Even the dishwashers had stopped their machines. Sensing the tension crackling through the air, Marcus stood there grinning, waiting for me to respond with my usual confused nod and broken English. Instead, I straightened my spine, looked him directly in the eyes, and made my choice. 3 months of careful character work was about to disappear in 30 seconds. ¿De verdad piensas que no te entiendo, pendejo? The Spanish words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Marcus's smug expression crumbled as I continued speaking, my voice growing stronger with each syllable. Tu español es terrible, y tus técnicas son peores. That sofrito you're so proud of. My grandmother was making it before you, could pronounce Cuba. Without waiting for permission, I walked straight to the stove where my family's ropa vieja was simmering. My movements transformed completely. Gone was the hesitant prep cook who fumbled with basic knife work. My hands moved with the precision of someone who'd been trained by masters, someone who understood that cooking wasn't just technique, but generations of culture flowing through fingertips. I grabbed a fresh piece of flank steak from the walk-in cooler and began breaking it down with quick, confident strokes. The kitchen staff gathered around, their mouths hanging open as they watched me work. Tommy whispered, "Holy shit, look at her knife skills." Even the dishwashers had abandoned their stations to witness whatever was happening. "This is pescado and salsa criolla," I announced, switching to a fresh pan and heating oil to the exact temperature needed. My great-grandmother's recipe from Santiago de Cuba. She made it for 70 years, never once measuring anything, because real Cuban cooking lives in your bones. James Calderon had moved closer to the kitchen, his notepad forgotten as he watched me work. Something clicked in his expression when he heard me describe the historical significance of each ingredient. The way I explained how Spanish colonizers had brought saffron to the Caribbean, how African slaves had introduced plantains, how Chinese immigrants in the 1800s had added their own touches to create modern Cuban cuisine. "Your surname," Calderon said quietly, his voice cutting through the kitchen noise. "Rodriguez. Are you related to Roberto Rodriguez?" The entire kitchen went silent. Even Marcus, who'd been sputtering in confusion, stopped mid-sentence. I looked up from my pan, meeting Calderon's eyes directly. "He's my father." The reaction was immediate and electric. 2 of the line cooks gasped. Maria dropped her knife. Tommy grabbed the counter for support. But Marcus looked like he'd been punched in the stomach, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing horror as he realized what this meant. "Roberto Rodriguez's daughter has been working as your prep cook?" Calderon asked Marcus, his tone sharp with disbelief. "The daughter of Cuba's most celebrated chef, and you've been treating her like—" He didn't need to finish. Everyone had witnessed Marcus's behavior. Everyone had heard his casual racism, his theft of tips, his constant belittling. And now they understood they'd been watching culinary royalty disguised as an entry-level worker. Marcus tried damage control, his voice cracking with desperation. I knew all along. This was just a test, a way to help her understand American kitchens from the ground up. But his earlier shock had been too genuine, his insults too cruel and spontaneous. I plated the pescado with steady hands, explaining each component while the critics watched in fascination. The fish was perfectly flaked, swimming in a sauce that had been perfected across 4 generations. The colors were vibrant: deep red tomatoes, golden saffron, bright green peppers creating a painting on white porcelain. Calderon took the first bite, and his eyes closed immediately. When he opened them, they were slightly wet. "This is extraordinary," he whispered. "It tastes like history." I removed my stained apron slowly, folding it neatly before placing it on the counter. I've been documenting workplace conditions in upscale restaurants for a book Chronicle Publishing is releasing next year. Marcus's behavior isn't unique. It represents systemic problems throughout this industry. The restaurant owner, hastily summoned by a panicked server, arrived just in time to hear Calderon tell Marcus to leave his own kitchen. I offered business cards to the kitchen staff who'd shown me kindness, promising job references and connections to restaurants that valued talent over abuse. As I walked toward the exit, I turned back one final time. "By the way, Marcus, my publisher is also interested in a documentary series. Your performance today was absolutely perfect." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. 3 months of careful planning had led to this moment, and watching his world crumble felt more satisfying than any dish I'd ever created. Calderon approached me, extending his hand with genuine respect. "Your father spoke about you during our interview years ago. He said you were studying in Paris but wanted to understand the real struggles of kitchen workers." His smile was warm, knowing. "I suspect this research goes deeper than most people realize." The other critics were already making notes, their earlier discomfort replaced by fascination. They'd witnessed something unprecedented. A master chef disguised among the exploited, documenting abuse from the inside. My story had just become their story. Marcus made one last desperate attempt. "This is all a misunderstanding. Isabella and I planned this together. It's a publicity stunt for the restaurant." But his voice cracked on every word. The panic in his eyes told the real truth. "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone, "I've been recording our conversations for 3 months. Your comments about immigrants, the stolen tips, the recipe theft, it's all documented." Marcus went pale again, realizing his career wasn't just damaged, it was finished. The kitchen staff began removing their aprons too. Tommy walked up and quit on the spot. Maria followed, saying she'd rather wash dishes somewhere else than work for a racist. Within 10 minutes, half the kitchen had walked out. The restaurant owner fired Marcus before the critics even left. Watching security escort him out while he stammered excuses felt like justice finally arriving. 3 months of swallowed pride had been worth this single moment. A week later, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Publishers wanted to move up my release date. Netflix called about documentary rights. Food Network offered me my own show. But the best call came from my father. "Mija," his voice crackled through the international connection. "I saw the video online. The whole world is talking about what you did." "Are you angry I didn't tell you everything?" He laughed. That deep belly laugh I'd grown up hearing. "Angry. I'm proud. You fought back with dignity, with skill, with truth. That's what real chefs do." 6 months later, Kitchen Confidential, an undercover investigation, hit bestseller lists. Marcus never worked in fine dining again. And every time someone asks how I got the idea for undercover research, I smile and remember that sometimes the best revenge is simply being better than your enemies ever imagined possible.